How are you all feeling today? Yeah, we had an eventful bar crawl yesterday. You all feeling good? Energized? Wonderful. Well, it is great to be here. It is day 4 of the GFTN Forum right here in Tokyo. And what a Japan's startup renaissance, as I mentioned. Please welcome onto the stage Ryo Kawashima, the Deputy Director for Innovation and Startup Promotion Division from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Over to you, Ryo.
Very good morning, everyone. So it's great to start with the presentation right after the beautiful instrument performance. Thank you very much for having me today. Okay, cool. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the Japan startup renaissance, the policies, capital, and global ambitions. So when you think about the such as food crisis, the poverties, and climate change, and also the well-beings. So you name it. For the last 30 years in the past, we have had innovators from Japan to global. So let's say the Sony, Honda, Nintendo invested in the listed companies and also the unlisted companies. But I have seen the many potential the companies that have the startup policies since 2022 under the former Prime Minister Kishida. So he drew up a 5-year plan with a view to increasing the number of the startups like the tenfold over the 5 years. And then the number of the startups has increased significantly. And now we're in a phase where we're gonna move on to the next step. So we are aiming high in terms of the one is talent and fund and also the business co-innovation. So these 3 pillars are indispensable for the development in the global Japanese startup ecosystem for overseas. And for example, the Sakana AI, probably you may have heard of it. They are the very successful. So we have seen the tenfold investment to the Japanese market. So over the past 10 years, we have tenfold, 10x investment. So behind that is coming into the Japanese market to find out the Japanese potential startups. And the many of the top accelerators coming is remarkable. Actually, the number of the startups coming from the university labs are increasing. So we understand the importance of the conversion. They are getting involved in developing the startup ecosystem together. So the government agencies provide services from the funding and the financial aid, and because they need a longer duration to develop the technologies and also the social implementation, we support them with the various the programs for longer term Japanese startups to aim for going global. So we encourage them to become the going global and also the going global with the support body. Requests will ask for you today. So one is that please meet our promising startups for companies. So we have the J Startup program. We nominated more than 200 companies on the list that has a potential to become the global leader Startup Expo 2025. So this year in Japan we have the World Expo in Kansai region. Besides that, we're gonna have the Global Startup Expo 2025, bringing the more investors and accelerators, startups in the Japanese market, and we're gonna discuss about the global, the co-creation, touch on the surface and the basic points about the Japanese startup ecosystem, but with the features of the 10x investment in the past 10 years, and also we understand and we try to encourage the deep tech startups get into the market more and more. And then last but not least, we need the group to see me, and my door is always open, and let's have a discussion about the potential initiatives and also the methods that we can implement. So feel free to ask me, and then let's create an innovation. altogether from Japan to the global. Thank you very much.
Down the latest trends, opportunities, and challenges in startup funding. So get ready for a very data-driven look at how founders are securing capital. And I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Charlie Pennington, who's the head of GTM for Carter, and he's got all of this insight. So do pay attention, and a big round of applause.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So yes, as mentioned, if I haven't had the chance to meet you yet, my name is Charlie Pennington, and I spearhead the go-to-market efforts for Carter in Asia Pacific and the Middle East as well. So what I'm going to be sharing with you over the next few minutes is a whole bunch of data and insights from the 45,000 customers that we have globally that run their equity through Carter. I'll share this again at the end. People tend to want to connect to me after I've shared the data rather than before, so we can have that quid pro quo. I also have to just quickly say, I'm not a lawyer, it's a disclaimer, we can skip this part too. Let's jump right into the reason why we're here today. So, the state of private markets, we've been collecting data on this since around 2018. So everything from the back end of 2018 up until the present day. I'm going to start by giving like a holistic overview of what we're seeing and kind of breaking it down on a quarterly basis as well. So some might say last year was a bit of a mixed bag. There were definitely some positives. If we look that despite the fact the number of rounds in terms of quantity went down, in terms of venture capital being injected, there was actually a nearly 20% increase in the actual capital that was being given to the startup ecosystem last year. So that's obviously very, very noteworthy and a positive trend that we are seeing. If we then break this down quarter by quarter, and this obviously then includes pre, during and post the pandemic bull run, we can actually see from what we've observed for the last 2 years that the stability and the reset of the market is definitely now taking shape, as the numbers are more akin to those before the bull run, with around 1,300, 1,700 deals being done per quarter, and roughly about $20 billion plus each quarter being invested as well. But something to take note for startups and investors in the room today, it's actually getting harder and harder to get from one stage to the next. If we look at some of the data points from a couple of years back, it could take just over a year to get from C to A to B, and so forth. However, what we're now seeing is an average of around 2 years to get there. Now, if you are a C stage company, for example, that means the cash that you are receiving has to last you just as long as it would from going from A to B. And as we know, the investment rounds aren't as large, so you've got to make less go further. Specific to fintech, we are seeing bridging rounds in fintech, kind of bucking the trend in terms of the averages. They're still pretty common in early stages, with around 50% at the seed and Series A stage actually being bridge rounds. Now, that might be okay in terms of the bridge side. The market conditions haven't been very conducive of IPOs or exits recently, and this is really seen if you look here.
Yes, sir. All over to you. Stage is yours.
Great, fantastic, firecracker. So here we go. I think you and I do the blue thing, and they do the sort of Silicon Valley thing. We're going to talk about liquidity, and specifically focusing on Japan. Japan is at a superbly interesting juncture because the real venture capital and startup boom really got going, about 10 years ago. With the Abe administration, I think in 2013, 2014, and 2015, record number of funds raised, the whole startup ecosystem really getting going. What's the state right now that all these funds raised 10 years ago are about to hit their expiry? Jordan?
So they're facing maturity and just figuring out what to do about it.
So what are they doing about it? like in all seriousness, you know, this is very exciting because any ecosystem is only as strong as it can survive and adapt in a downturn. And for all intents and purposes, you know, we are sort of crash testing the Japanese VC ecosystem right now. What's it look like on the ground?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just throw a couple points in there as context to frame the rest of the conversation. So as you mentioned, like 2012, there was almost no VC in Japan. And so 2013, 2014, 2015 was the big ramp up, and that's where the numbers just earlier as well were cited that we had a 10x growth in VC over a decade, and then the 5-year startup plan to 10x it again, right? And so that's one piece where now these funds are facing maturity. It's been 10 or it's been 10 plus 2, and there aren't many liquidity options. IPO has been the common path for most companies in Japan. 100 companies go public a year, average market cap less than $100 million. And most of these companies don't go on to change the world, right? The last few years, topics up 50%, small cap down 50%. And these people who are buying on these small IPOs are not necessarily doing well over a long period of time. As part of the 5-year startup plan, there's been a bit of a push for unicorns, right? How do we go from, say, 10 to 100 unicorns, right? How can we become the largest startup hub in Asia? And from my experience, these muscles that you need as an organization to go public at a very small valuation are very different from the muscles that you need to continue to go after massive growth. And unfortunately, if funds have a 10-year maturity and they're investing in you in year 3 or 4, and you reach your Series A, which we just learned is taking longer and longer, and then, it's year 7, you have a mandate to do your best, to go public before the fund maturity, which means that you're starting the IPO process around your Series A with maybe $1 million in revenue, and you're going to go public maybe around $10 million of revenue, and you're going to have de-risked into that IPO. And even if the founders think they're going to go back to growth after that, it's the organizational muscles are completely different. And so the IPO, small IPO, is not a great path. However, if now there's a trend for companies to have pressure to go public later and later, that's going to mean there's going to be even more liquidity problems, and we need the alternative infrastructure for the small IPO. M&A, do you really want to, in the States, ex-Google employees getting bought by Google culturally makes sense. In Japan, you don't have the decacorns, the major startup cultural companies that would make sense to acquire and take advantage of these assets in the same way. And so secondary markets are starting to become part of the lingo. I think a couple of years ago, if I said secondaries, most people in Japan wouldn't know what I'm talking about, maybe secondhand clothing. And now, pretty much every VC I talk to, it's like they're very well aware of the pain. They're facing it themselves. Everybody has liquidity needs. But by my estimations, there's only maybe $200 million of secondary liquidity for about $2 billion of secondary demand. And it's only set to grow as over the last decade we've had larger and larger funds.
I mean, it's my experience. I mean, I'm an advisor to 2 of the VC funds here, and we had to do an extension, and it took 18 months to negotiate the extension because the domestic investors, right, which thank God, they're now part of the ecosystem, which 10, 12 years ago was not the function. They refused to sign because no, it's a 10-year contract. What's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to write things down, right? And I think part of the problem is that you have to face the reality at some point of where valuations are. And if you invest at the top and things aren't there, and I mean, there's this concept I was hearing talking about earlier, is like DPI is the new IRR, right? So instead of just looking at okay, what's your
English?
So instead of what are your returns on paper, how much cash is actually getting returned to investors, right? And that's the liquidity, and that's the lubricant that makes the whole ecosystem work and grow. And if that cash is getting redistributed back to founders, early employees, angel investors, early investors, and that also kind of triggers this power shift from maybe the old school capital and the investors to new people who are building the future of the economy in Japan. So I do think that fund maturities are a reality. In the States, the secondary markets is estimated over $100 billion, whereas I just mentioned that in Japan we're maybe $200 million. And yes, we're a burgeoning ecosystem, but supply and demand imbalance is very real. And there isn't that much of kind of the global best practice. So as we have more and more, like a fast-growing market, there's going to be other inefficiencies that grow like this. And
Now, Ria, as a GP, raising funds, investing, how do you look at the current state of liquidity in Japan?
Yes, I mostly agree with Jordan on the point that small IPOs have really had, provided the liquidity for startups, but also had a lot of negative impact on the economy in Japan as a whole. I think one of the reasons is that obviously when you go small, Japan doesn't have a lot of small institutional investors, so big institutional investors look for certain valuation and certain trading volume, so they're not gonna buy your equity, so you have to rely on retail investors. And having retail investors it's not a great thing for founders. Your long-term strategy, they often don't understand, so you have to kind of like give the short-term results. So I really think that that really kind of caps the growth of the startups. And the other thing I feel in Japan is that this is not just startup problem, but even in traditional sectors, there are too many small, medium companies that are competing against each other, providing the same product and services, and that results in smaller margins. And just now the government wants more global startups to come from Japan, but for startup to go global, you have to first monopolize the domestic market, potentially raise your margin, so that with your stability and your resources you can go global. So that small IPO has really made it difficult for Japanese startups to go global, and that had negative impact on the Japanese economy as a whole. So that I find that quite a big issue here, and yeah.
Just to put some meat around this, because this is absolutely fascinating. Japan is hyper competitive, right? There is, when you look at the industry verticals from hairdresser to chip making, right? In the average vertical, the top 4 companies in Japan control 12% of revenues in that vertical. In the United States, it's now 35% of the vertical revenues. There's been a lot of roll-ups. America is oligopolistic. You've got the moat, right, that companies have built. Here, it's a red ocean of excessive competition. And it's exciting. My family office, the best performing fund that we invest in is a fund that shorts all Japanese IPOs 20 days after listing. Because it looks, whoa, and then it just, no, it doesn't find a bottom. It's money, it's a shame, and it's bad for capital markets. It's bad for the economy. You're a CEO. Talk to me a little bit about the temptation of doing an IPO.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm the chief executive and founder of.
I don't need an introduction. Everybody knows.
Sure. But so just a small anecdote, right? During fundraising, we just raised our Series A, which yes was harder and longer. The biggest question everybody asks was like, "What's your plan for IPO?" And I'm like, "I got none." And so that sort of generates like the blank stare and this, sucking of the teeth. What do you mean? It's like, well, actually, IPOing in Japan is not really such a great outcome for an entrepreneur, especially if you do it too early in the cycle. And there's plenty of evidence that people do so. However, having been in other markets, particularly, I've been an investor for over a decade in Europe and North America, and an entrepreneur in Singapore, where I exited in 2021, the peak time, right? Now, Japan has a very, very particular capital markets for entrepreneurs because of very, very few options. And the very few options for exit, things are improving, but it seems like there's a real value that the average entrepreneur here places on IPO, almost like psychologically, emotionally, there's a drive towards IPO. The M&A market, which I actually really value, it's been fantastic for us outside of Japan. I think that's an area that it's an area that needs to grow, needs to develop further, both domestically and through foreign funds that are actually really now structurally looking at Japan differently, right? So my experience, particularly in raising capital as a Japanese startup and looking at the combination of local versus global investors, finally over the last couple of years, Japan has gotten onto the roadshow of some of the largest global funds. Prior to that was like, well, yes, Southeast Asia, ex-China, ex-Japan. That was like classic, right? So things are improving, but the short version is that Japan still has a very emerging ecosystem. You see this as a function of the demand side, the typology and the sheer number of entrepreneurs, well, not so much, and the size of the economy and the size of the opportunities and the size of the supply from a capital perspective is also still very small. So it's an emerging ecosystem. We need more capital across all the cycles, but particularly in growth stage, basically post-Series A, and ideally coming from institutional investors, private equity firm. Secondary markets, you're right, I have never heard anyone here talking about secondaries, so it's like, what is that? I think that
it's a clothing business.
It is, it's a certain clothing business. That I think needs to be part of the vocabulary, right? Both for entrepreneurs and for investors. And there's also, outside of Japan, it's very common for startups to actually do roll-up without startups, right? So this is a second, third, fourth generation of entrepreneurs. They actually exit, make the first exit even so great, but the second and the third is definitely better. So this evolution of, if you like, the landscape through the eyes of entrepreneurs just hasn't quite evolved here. So I want more growth opportunities across all sectors.
I mean, just again, to give some numbers to the whole thing. I mean, in Japan, give or take, over the last 5 years, you've got 83% of all exits being IPO. The rest, some M&A that's going on. In the United States, just as comparison, it's exactly the other way around. You've got more than 80%, which is merger, and the rest is IPO. The second big difference is that of an IPO in Japan, basically 78% of the initial investor uptake is individual, is Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe. It's not institutional. In the United States, again, you've got basically 80-85% of the uptake being institutional investors here, right?
And they're choosing the stocks on the basis of how good the cookies are at the end.
How good the cookies are. Right, the cookies are very important.
Very important you have good cookies at the age.
And he's not talking about the digital cookies.
No.
Right? We're talking physical stuff that you can eat. It's called omotenashi, right? Now, Russell, you're the exception. Russell, the founder of Paydi, the payments firm, and that still, to date, is the single largest M&A acquisition, M&A exit here. Talk a little bit about your journey and how you were thinking about it.
Sure. Although before we get, I do want to say, I think we need all of these pieces, just so we're not shitting on IP, you need all of these things together. It's just this idea that the mix of tools at everyone's disposal, or components of the ecosystem. I think what everybody here says is true, but all of these things need to be there. So our journey, we raised a reasonably large amount of capital over time. It was more than 300 million US in equity across four main rounds. We were pursuing an IPO path. I think that this is why you need to kind of have all of these things at your disposal, because it becomes a forcing function on the different things. But we were not culturally fixated on being public market chacho or kaicho, and not everybody is. I mean, I think again, if you look in Japan, there are some there are people that have done the other model, right? The founder of Mercari sold his first startup to Zynga. That created a little bit of mental space, and then he obviously went and had a huge success with Mercari, which did go public and is obviously a multi-billion-dollar company. But anyway, our experience was basically, as Sam says, all of the sort of Series C, Series D were offshore investors, which by the way is great. I mean, I keep telling entrepreneurs in Japan, in fact, Sam was one of them, although as experienced as she is, there is a benefit for all of us in Japan, which is it isn't from a sovereign risk perspective, people don't worry about it, right? If we were doing startups in other places, whatever, choose someplace less stable than here. I'll let you choose, I won't choose for you. The sovereign risk.
America.
Well, there you go. Not anymore. Trump. So basically, that being said, the sovereign piece is not a big deal. And in my experience, Paydi was this kind of accepted business model. It's a BNPL player, so it's like Afterpay or Klarna. It obviously has some very particular nuances to Japan, which were valued in the acquisition process, but in essence was a proven business model. So we were able to raise money from global investors, especially in the growth phase, who were already huge investors in Klarna, in Afterpay, in whatever, XYZ. So they really understood the business model. And then
higher labor costs, they need to somehow increase productivity. So I think that's how a lot of corporates started to do. There's a trend of corporate venture capital where they're kind of trying now to buy some technology, but I think there's not so much you can do when you just take minority share. And also it's not great for the startups because, you know, startups can increase their market size when they disrupt. If Uber was providing a software for taxis, they wouldn't have been this valuation, but just because they are disrupting the traditional industries, they can have such a huge the total market size. So that corporate kind of pressure is also negative, but at the same time, there's so much capital sitting in the corporates which could be utilized. And I think I'm quite optimistic that there is going to be a bit more shift on the M&As from CVCs, because I think corporates are starting to realize that just taking minority doesn't really help with their productivity. Also, it's very difficult to achieve both return and the strategic angle because they're starting to change every 3 to 5 years. Early stage startups pivot many times, so it doesn't really match. So I think there's going to be a lot more M&As happening from corporates, which could provide liquidity to startups. And you know, it might not be the best solution, but the founders can try again. And the other thing that's very important, what liquidity provides, is that I think the founders who exit and cash out, they can create more dynamic angel investor ecosystem, which is lacking in Japan. So I do think I'm quite optimistic that there's still a lot of cash sitting in the corporate that could be utilized in a better way in the future.
Just as a thought, I wonder if this also changes where, you know, if, as we heard from Mehdi as well, you know, if there's more of an emphasis on, you know, deep tech or drug discovery, things that are not, you know, not SaaS, not consumer products, where it's less of an issue from an acquisition standpoint that you need to, you know, onboard all of these people with a different culture. And if you're really going and it's more like, you know, patent acquisition or just there may be more of that. And I think big Japanese corporates may be more comfortable to say, okay, you know, we're obtaining this IP, not necessarily we have all of these, you know, people that are so different from our existing corporate culture. Anyway, just, do you think it may change it a little, maybe, right?
With that, and as some of you know, I'm on the board of OIS, the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology, and you know, this attitude, right, of deep tech, right, and deep talk, long duration funding, 15-year funding, rather than 10-year funding, because yes, you know, if you start from a scientific discovery to actually, you know, proof of concept, commercialization, etc., you know, is going to take much longer. The amazing thing is there's lots of money available for that. Right? So then that's where the trading companies, that's where even the Japanese trust banks and the insurance companies, they actually are very long-winded. So patient capital is actually available, but it's not being tapped. And that ecosystem is starting to be developed now. Jordan, I have a question. No, you have something that you wanted to say.
I had 2 points. One was actually to contradict a little bit on the competition, where I have a different view. But before that, I want to clarify one thing about liquidity and the topic of this. I think we talked about it being Ms. Watanabe buying the IPOs. Russell mentioned kind of having a dual track, you know, IPO versus M&A options. You talked about secondary markets. From what I've seen, it's around $500 million market cap, where it starts to become interesting and relevant for institutional investors. So institutional investors will usually need to be able to sell a certain position in a certain period, and that's why it needs to be of that size. And like, so I think it's almost, I mean, it's like what, like close to unicorn size in US. And so I think targeting more unicorns, I think makes a lot of sense, aligning with trying to get more institutional investors interested in Japanese equities and growth and actually things coming out of that. The point that I wanted to make around competition stems from that, which is that I don't think Japanese startups are generally targeting large enough things, so they never actually threaten the large established players. And in the States, if I'm going to be starting a company, there's going to be 10 other teams, all really talented serial entrepreneurs going after the exact same thing with a lot of capital. And so the hit ratio is much lower, right? Everyone thinks they have a shot on goal, but you're going after a much larger prize. Whereas in Japan, like most companies like don't actually fail. Like maybe become zombies, but relatively, like you can continue to grind it out and maybe eventually make it to a small, you know, IPO or something like that over many, many years. So I actually think there's not enough competition in the startup ecosystem in Japan. And some of that is not necessarily just because we're competing on margins, but actually via real innovation and trying to make things sometimes better and trying to do things, like when there's more competition, you're forced to go after more ambitious, more riskier methods. And then if you're gonna have companies that actually become a decacorn, dare say, or a $10 billion company or something that could then really make a dent in a large company, you're gonna have real pressure to not just be like, okay, we're kind of invested, we kind of see this all, be like, oh, there's actually someone threatening our business. And I think that will be a much more real catalyst for change.
I'm going to say something here that I apologize if this doesn't sound so culturally sort of sensitive, but you know, Japan is really made for the grind, and you see this at every level. I was like really shocked to see and speak to entrepreneurs that have been doing more or less the same thing for 15 years, more or less with the same sort of level of growth and sort of KPIs. And so this one is very specific, I think, also to the mindset. It's not necessarily a, you know, it's not necessarily a merit judgment on this approach, but I'm saying it's distinctly Japanese. This wouldn't happen elsewhere. The investors wouldn't have that kind of patience. The entrepreneurs would not have that kind of patience, and probably even the consumers won't have that kind of patience. So this is true also for capital, right? So it kind of translates, and it also I mean, I'm saying something everybody knows, right? I mean, it takes longer here to do everything, and it translates in every single aspect, even the time that it takes to start up to get to a reasonable level of KPIs.
So just to add some numbers to this, right? Japan's productivity is basically running at about half of the United States of America. And if you actually just do the econometrics, you figure out the reason is not lack of entry. It's not lack of startups. It's not lack of entrepreneurship. The reason is lack of exit. Japanese companies don't die. 12% of Japan's listed company, these are the greedy guys, right? 12% of Japan's listed companies over the last 5 years have not been able to cover their interest expense, which, given that interest rates are zero, is actually very difficult to do. You know, so again, where does this red ocean of excessive competition come from is because of what I call financial socialism. Do you know that 2/3 of all Japan's commercial loans are guaranteed by you, the Japanese taxpayer? 2/3. That's better than East Germany, right? In its heydays. Now, the exciting thing is that this financial socialism is being withdrawn. Thank you, the Bank of Japan is increasing interest rates. But more importantly, in the December board decision, the Bank of Japan decided to stop its lending program. The Bank of Japan has about 77 trillion yen, this is a 600 trillion yen economy, 77 trillion yen of loans are done, commercial loans are done by the Bank of Japan. This will roll off. The average duration of that loan is 2.5 years. So now the zombies will die. And this is great news for you in this space, you know, because number one, you can actually go the other way around. You can be the startup that actually now can acquire a Japanese company and take part of their workforce, take part of their supplier network, etc., etc. So that, I think, is the exciting part. Now, tell me one thing, and this is, I don't know, this is to all of you. Are Japanese founders too proud? Because, you know, all they want to do is, you know, do the IPO and sail into the sunset as Kaicho when they're 92.
So I was at a party a couple weeks ago with about 12...
a party?
A great party, a dozen, 12...
It was sponsored by Hitachi.
No.
Thank you, Hitachi.
It was sponsored by 12 founders that went public in the last year.
12. Right.
It was a small group of other founders. I looked afterwards, and most of these companies have been public for around a year on average now. Average market cap is around $30 million. Right? And so I'm talking to the founders and trying to understand, and they're sharing different perspectives. And you know, I do think the reality right now is that a listed company CEO, the status of that is far above the concept of some unicorn founder or decacorn founder, right? Like that status, and I think if you look back to maybe a decade ago when many of these companies were started,
Japan was, in some ways, people go after status. You work at the largest possible companies because that gives you social credibility, and you can marry somebody like, oh yes, you work at a large company, you must be a credible person. And the rare people who went the entrepreneur path, maybe because they couldn't get into large companies or because, weird or cool or whatever reason it was, the path to social kind of credibility was going public. And that's what, if you have 100 companies go public a year, that's the path. That's what all the senpais have done. Everybody who's out in drinking in Ginza every night, like, if you want liquidity personally, if you want to do right by your shareholders, if you want to do right by society, that was seen as the kind of success metric and the goal. And unfortunately, that is a goal that becomes optimized for. And so I think building that alternative track to the small IPO, how we can lift up and actually say it's cooler to do something bigger, it's actually in Japan's best interest, and how we can kind of lift those people more on a pedestal and create more role models, people like Russell and others, that's our biggest challenge.
And that's where the cool stuff happens. You've heard me say this before. Over the last 8 years, 1 in 4 young men and women who join the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of the Economy, 1 in 4 leaves within the first 8 years of being at the elite, high status, very good status. And of those people leaving the elite bureaucracy, you actually find that 3/4 of them go to startups. And when you talk to them, it's very interesting. You say, no, it's risk management. Because if it works, I'm good. If it doesn't work, within 3 hours, Hitachi will offer me a job.
Capitalism is great in this sense, and I think talent as the leading indicator of where the ecosystem is going is what I'm most excited about. It's just how do we now provide this alternative path to the FPO? Sorry, I don't call it an IPO, it's a final public offering, because there's no liquidity for these companies afterwards. That's, I think, what we all need to, collectively build.
Just to jump, but I think you have to have some sympathy, right? Entrepreneurship is such a personal journey, and people have to respond, or people naturally do respond to what are their own motivations and incentives and whatever. And Jordan, you make a good point. Over time, this does change, and obviously there's the different cultural norms that are around, and it may have been, historically, like when I started being an entrepreneur in Japan, it was almost 20 years ago now. There were very few people that really wanted to do it. So you could see that they really had to challenge the status quo to do it. So I can understand why they really wanted that brass ring at the end. But so I guess my point is I don't want us to come across as too judgy. Like obviously everybody has their own.
To your point, it's about having options, right? And all these people worked so hard to get to where they did, and they should be incredibly proud of what they accomplished. And I don't mean to diminish that in the least, just there isn't an alternative path. And several of those were like, if there was a path to take more capital, if I understood how other capital markets worked outside of Japan and how other founders work, if I had that field of view, that's, I think, just having those multiple paths and multiple different types of role models.
I think diversity of models that are perceived to be successful, desirable, I think it's very, very important, right? So, and I think we've seen this certainly outside of Japan, and in terms of the diversity relate to.
Yeah. I wanted to point that out that I think on the culture part, it's in terms of the exit market, it's important to give options, but on the culture part, it's very important to have more, non-Japanese, different. Founders with different diverse backgrounds, because I think Japan does have this closed culture that is kind of, everybody has a bit more conservative and kind of, opinion that everyone agrees to. So I think having that diverse founders will change the culture, and I'm so proud that I'm the only Japanese here today. I deeply respect, you guys.
Not based in Japan though.
But I think this is what we need, and that, not just on the founder side, but on the investor side, that provides different opinions and diverse options for founders. So, yeah.
Well, which is why this forum is so good. So, thank you to our sponsor, Hitachi.
We didn't talk about something. We're running a little bit out of time, and I want to do one lightning round and put you on the test here. But one thing that is also very noteworthy is over the last 18 months, you've seen a very, very positive evolution of debt financing for startups, which basically, again, 5 years ago was not possible for all intents and purposes, but you've got even the big money center banks now actually being capable and willing to actually provide loans debt finance to startups. So that's a very healthy indicator that the ecosystem is being crash tested. There are many new tests that are coming through here, but actually the evolution is positive because it's not just equity. Now there's actually debt finance that is also available. Quick lightning round. You've got exactly 5 seconds to answer. If you answer more than 5 seconds, it's a bottle of champagne for everybody in the audience. Everybody actually touching. One piece of advice to either an investor, a startup, or the Japanese government. What should they do to make the ecosystem better?
Replace any statement of IPO as a goal with make $100 million in revenue first and then think about anything else.
Revenues, not IPO. Real.
And to your point, let zombie companies die. That will create more companies to come up.
I love it. You kill the zombies. We love it. Okay, so we shall increase interest rates. Russell.
For all of those constituents, growth solves all problems.
Growth solves all problems.
Make English a common entry exam for everybody going to university. I think that would help a lot for founders.
By the way, it's very interesting on the English language side, right? There's a lot about, startups, your market is global, you've got to be global right away, so you've got to obviously speak English, right? Not German. But, but this is actually also very, very important for the GPs and for the LPs. Because, if you're a Japanese investor and you don't speak English, how, to Russell's point earlier, how can you do the comparison, right, to what goes on in the United States, in Europe, in Israel, right? And the quality of, unfortunately, and I'm allowed to say this, the quality of the Japanese investment community, of the asset management community, is still terrifying, because they barely know where Osaka is, except, of course, the people at Hitachi. Thank you very much. It's been exciting. I hope you enjoyed it, and I think everybody is contactable. Thank you very much.
GFTN's wide-ranging network, which lays. So I asked an AI to predict and put together my speech today, and it came right back with a 500-page document. So I've taken the liberty of summarizing it into something a bit more manageable for all of us today. Maybe I should have asked the AI to also summarize it for me. Start with AI. With the rapid advance such as Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, IOSCO, and the IAIS are all devoting many hours of discussions to advance the risk management. There's no doubt that it will have significant impact.
Together and so wonderful. Well, with that, we have come to the end of this GFTN forum, the 4 days of panels, insights, speakers. Did you guys have a great time? Wow. And I should say, it's 4 days of all the panel insights. We've got one more day tomorrow if you've signed up for the Innovation Tours. So can I remind you once again, Innovation Tours, a great chance to go around Tokyo, to see what's out there. You get to go to places like the Bank of Japan Museum to find out a little bit more about finance and technology.